Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the International African American Museum Center for Family History podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Shelley Viola Murphy, and I'm thrilled to have you join us today. What promises to be an engaging discussion. I'd like to give a special welcome to any museum members that are tuning in. This podcast is live streaming right now on YouTube and other social media venues and at the museum in Charleston, South Carolina. We are proud to bring you this monthly podcast series held on the third Saturday of each month. This is where we look at topics and explore African American history, genealogy, and cultures to life. These conversations are part of our ongoing commitment to connecting communities with their rich and diverse heritage. I'm joined by Brian Sheffy, the director of the Center for Family History at the museum. He is in the background and monitoring the chat and so forth. So, as we move through our discussion today, liberty and belonging, American Jews in the Revolutionary War, we encourage the attendees to participate actively. If you have questions, just put them in the chat box. And if you think about it, put a Q in front of it. This way, we'll be able to spot it quickly. We will open the floor for Q&A at the end of the discussion that we have. So let's welcome our distinguished guest, Dr. Adam Jortner. Please take a moment and introduce yourself, share your titles, and tell us a little bit about your roles.
Oh, thanks very much, Shelley. I'm Dr. Adam Jortner. I teach at Auburn University in Alabama. And I wrote a book called The Promised Land, Jewish Patriots, the American Revolution, and the Birth of Religious Freedom, which is the story of the American Jews during the Revolution, which is one of those pieces of history that has been sort of forgotten. But the remarkable story is that not only did American Jews join the revolution, they were welcomed into the revolution by the patriots, by the army, and they served in the armed forces, which they and as officers, which they were not allowed to do in Europe. And it allowed me to sort of take a look at Jewish life throughout North America at the time of the revolution, and the ways very specifically religious freedom changes from 1776 to 1790 when the revolution is finished, the Constitution is passed, and that was a great privilege.
Well, I'm so glad you're spending time with us. And again, we want I have some questions for our discussion. And I absolutely assumed they were involved, but didn't know in what they were doing. And so that's why this topic is fascinating to me. I am a daughter of the Daughters of the American Revolution and so forth. So I know that American Jews were definitely involved. So, can you tell us a little bit about the Jews living in the American colonies at the time of the Revolution and how racially and socially diverse were these communities?
Right. You have most of the Jewish population in the British colonies is located in 5 cities: Newport, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, and Savannah. Uh, and many of these Jews are the descendants of, they're either direct descendants of Spanish and Portuguese Jews, often Portuguese, or they are descendants of Portuguese Jews who spent time in the Caribbean and then came north. And what you have is what was fascinating to me is that this is in North America, in British North America,
Mm-hmm.
something important happens by accident, which is that because there are so few Jews, Jewish is no longer used as a racial classification. It's still being used in Europe, it's still being used in the Caribbean, but it's not being used in North America. So this is an interesting. I don't think the Jews who showed up in British North America intended it to work this way, but it allows them to shift your racial classification, so that this is where sort of the idea of whiteness is sort of being created, and that's sort of it's sort of squishy, but it basically means that someone of European descent who happens to be Jewish can have the same racial classification,
Hmm.
which is interesting. There are also Jews of multi-ethnic descent, Jews who are descended from African and Native Americans as
Hmm.
well. So that you have a situation where often there are enslaved mothers and Jewish fathers.
Hmm.
And this creates in the synagogues and in the Jewish communities a lot of inherent struggles because, according to Jewish law, the mother, for someone to be Jewish, the mother also has to be Jewish. And
Has to be Jewish. Okay.
footnote: in 21st century Judaism, this is a talking point. That Reform Jews don't follow this, but in the 18th century, it's a different question. So that the question of, well, are you Jewish, then
Right.
overlaps in the case of a free father and enslaved mother
Hmm.
with questions of racial descent. Um, Despite that, we have a lot of good evidence that there were some Black Jews who continued to practice Judaism, and in one case in Suriname, in the Caribbean, actually formed their own congregation, which operated for a few years in a sort of pseudo. It was operating sort of semi legally, which means they were means they were living Jewish lives, and they were almost getting recognition from the government, but not quite.
So wait, let's back up a little bit.
Sure.
So you're saying there's Black Jewish synagogues
There
in the
is
Caribbean or here in British America or North America?
so, and this is all Shelley. This is all a lot of this is theoretical, by which I mean I have
Okay.
evidence for it, but they didn't talk about it.
Okay.
One thing I probably most of our listeners will know, um, when we talk about the Black Church
Hmm.
in British North America, by which I mean, from 1600 to 1800,
Hmm.
when we talk about the Black Church, we are talking about Christianity as it's practiced and lived out by Black Christians, but which is not legally recognized for the most part, until the first legal recognition doesn't come till 1770,
Okay.
maybe 1773. But that's so that we talk about the Black Church, which means there's no official institution. There's no tax list. They're not going to leave the kind of records that your Episcopalians or the Methodists leave, but they are there. They are worshiping.
Hmm.
In the same way, at a much smaller scale, I think we have evidence that there is a Black synagogue, particularly in the Caribbean. There's a much higher percentage of the percentage of the population that's Jewish is higher in the Caribbean than in British North America, but also in places like Savannah and Charleston. We do have evidence that there are Black Jews living and to a certain extent participating in the life of the synagogue. Now, that last part where they participate in the life of the synagogue, that's very catch as catch can. But in terms of what's going on in the Caribbean, there's pretty good evidence that Black Jews organize and have their own worship ceremonies. And in this one case in Suriname, they actually make the transition to sort of having some kind of legal recognition for a few years at the end of the 18th century. Um, and I think it points to not just the variety of religious experience that is going on
Hmm.
in the colonial world, though I think that's important, um, but it also goes to the extent to which we're still trying to reconstructing the religious lives
Hmm.
uh, of people of African descent, particularly those who are enslaved, is still something that we need historians for, and we need
Absolutely.
archaeologists for. Um, because it's very exciting because you are trying to reconstruct something that was incredibly personal and incredibly hidden. Because, of course, all of these things, which would have been legal for a free person to do, were forbidden.
Correct.
For the most part, the enslaved people have no right to worship God as they
Right.
please.
Right.
And so um, it
So
is.
this could also be a very touchy subject, I imagine,
Oh yeah,
in certain realms. So let me ask you a question, because in the genealogy world, we've got DNA right now. And there are, that I know personally, a lot of, say, African Americans that you have Jewish, Ashkenazi Jewish showing up in the DNA, and it's a percentage. And I'm just wondering, when you name those cities, and I want to know why just those cities in English America and the Caribbean, why is it just those? And I think of, for me, I'm thinking, okay, that's where the ships came in, might be another reason that, like Charleston and so forth. But and I get Charleston to the Caribbean because where the museum is built at is on Gadsden's Wharf. And that has a direct tie to Barbados and ships coming in and so forth. So I'm trying to just make sure we understand, why was it just those few cities? Well, five cities I think you named: Savannah, Charleston, so forth. Why those? And did you say New York or no?
I did say New York.
Okay. Okay.
So obviously, the first thing to mention is uh, um, talking about white Jews, Jews of Europe of European descent, and then Jews of not non-European descent.
Okay.
Why there are five cities where there are Jewish communities large enough to support a synagogue. Now,
Got it.
why are the and I should this is important to note. There are, at the time the revolution breaks out, there's four synagogues in the 13 states that rebel, and there is something like 11 in the Caribbean. So there's more Jewish settlement in the Caribbean than in British North America. Um, as to why those five cities, um, those are the cities to whom very early in the 17 in the early days, this is where Jewish communities are able to get a foothold. And again, the legal status of Jews shifts continually. Um, but for example, when Georgia is originally intended as a free colony, that does not work out. But when it is still supposed to be a free colony, they actually invite a number of Jewish families to come settle there. And I may have just Shelley, I seem to have lost you. I'm going to continue on with my story though, as though nothing had happened. Oh, hi, Brian. um, anyway, um, so those five cities are places where Jews were allowed to settle. Um, and of course, that's not the only place where you'd find Jewish people in British North America, but that's where they're large enough to have their own religious communities. But I don't want to give the impression that it's only Charleston and South Carolina where we get uh, Black Jews and Jews of multiracial descent, because the two most famous Black Jews in America are uh, very much Isaac and Sarah Brandon, who are the children of an enslaved mother named Sarah and a Jewish father who actually has them officially converted. They live in Barbados. He takes Isaac and Sarah into Suriname, where he has them become Jewish. They undergo the ritual mikvah. Uh, Isaac undergoes circumcision, and then he sends them on to Britain, where they begin the process of passing for white. And by the 1820s, both of the both of the Brandon siblings have settled in New York, where they are listed on the census records as white, and they actually get their portraits done. And when someone in the past gets their portrait done, and that person, is not a New England minister, you jump up and down as a historian. But they actually have their portraits made, and they're the first multi-ethnic Jews that we have portraits of. And their family lineage was something of an open secret, but otherwise they're accepted by the New York Jewish community.
So, in what ways did the Jewish, and to the audience, sorry for the technical difficulty. I'm in a place that's kind of remote, and my internet is not that great right now. So hang in with us. So appreciate Brian and Dr. Jointner here. So, in what ways can you describe that the Jews did participate in the Revolutionary War, and how did that serve as help or fail to help in secure Jewish belonging to the new nation once the independence of Great Britain was there?
So there's a couple of ways in which this sort of works. In general, the Jews in the colonies tended to support the Patriots more than they supported the Loyalists, because one of the things the Patriots are saying is the country should be made up of its citizens. We shouldn't, everyone should have an equal voice. We shouldn't let someone in London make decisions for us. That has some attraction for folks who are the Jews are not they're not as free as a Protestant would be. They volunteer for the military, where they are not only accepted, but they are promoted to officer status. And this is a bit of a mystery. We're not sure why the Americans made Jews officers. I suspect that it is because Washington really needs the troops. And simply the fact that he would promote Jews to officer status, that can't happen in Europe because every European state has a church. And that means that every European army is, to a certain extent, an army of the church, a Christian army. And you can't have Jewish officers in a Christian army. And I think that goes to the other interesting thing, which is in Britain, in 1776, in Britain, there's a state church, the Church of England. Sometimes it's a different church, but there's always an established church, which means when the Americans break from the king, they're also breaking from a state church.
That's
That
right.
wasn't their intention, but that's what they do. And so there aren't any oaths that people have to take. So Mordecai Sheftall, who's a noted Jewish patriot in Savannah, actually becomes the leader of there's an ad hoc group that's put together. They kick the governor out in 1776, and Mordecai Sheftall becomes the head of essentially running Savannah. Under British law, he has to take an oath not only to the king, but to the New Testament. But when they overthrow the governor, he doesn't have to take that oath. And what I think what I really found remarkable was not only do these things happen, but over and over again, when the question comes up, can we have a Jew fight for the patriot cause? The answer is yes. So there's a case where there's a New York Jew who's serving to guard New York right before the British invade, and he asks to have Fridays off for Shabbat services, and yes, that is okay. And sort of sometimes there is actually a group of Jews fighting in the militia, which is known as the Jew Company, because they have so many Jewish members at the Battle of Beaufort. But they call themselves the Free Citizens. And I think in some ways this kind of support doesn't just give sort of, I mean, it's at a very brutal sense, it's good press for Jewish Americans, but they go on to make the claim, after the revolution ends, we've made as many sacrifices as anybody else, and we should be entitled to the same rights of free citizenship, which essentially is voting rights that they consider to be voting rights and the right to serve in public office. Every state that has a Jewish community in 1776, Jews cannot serve anywhere in public office in British North America. After the revolution, by 1792, every state that has a Jewish population has gotten rid of laws that say only Christians can hold. Um, and then, remarkably, in 1808, in both the US, in North Carolina, and in British North America, in Quebec, a Jewish guy gets elected to the legislature, even though technically that's illegal. And in North Carolina, they
Did they know?
yeah, yeah, well, apparently not. Apparently not. um,
Okay.
in both cases, they win their election, and then somebody's like, "I don't think we should let a Jew hold this office."
Right,
And
right.
in both cases, there's a political crisis. In North Carolina, they let the guy take a seat. In Quebec, they say, "No, you can't take your seat." It's a really interesting way of sort of pointing out, like, okay, where have ideas that your citizenship is not dependent upon your religious confession sort of taken root much more deeply in the new United States. um, Having said all of that, I also, as I said before, there is also the extent to which in the new United States Jews are being classified as white
Right.
in a political universe, in a government that is increasingly coming to see things in terms of racial dissent. And there actually is a court case in the 1780s. And this is one of the, I talked about Mordecai Sheftall, and he was maybe not the best dude. Um, because he actually is involved in a
Don't really.
lawsuit about Cherokee land in the
Mhm.
western part that was claimed by Georgia, and he's actually involved in a lawsuit with one of his cousins, who is also Jewish and is also of Creek Indian descent. And
Wow.
the legal decision that was made there was Mordecai Sheftall can claim these rights as a citizen because he's white, even though he's Jewish, and his cousin cannot, because his cousin is, by virtue of having some Native American descent, not a citizen. So there is an actual a case that said, yeah, race kind of trumps religion in these cases. Um, so I don't want to pretend that the story of Jews achieving religious freedom in the United States is for lack of a better term, all good news. I'm a big fan of religious freedom, but it's clearly also there's a dynamic of race that is beginning to play um, more heavily in a world where there aren't going to be religious distinctions made by the government.
So, how did the American Jews during this time, the ones that are here, and I don't know the hundreds or the thousands in the different locations or whatever the numbers are.
That
I
is
know
okay.
it's not thousands and thousands. I just don't know. But how did they relate to slavery or enslavers, critics, bystanders, or even something more complicated? Kind of what's going on now? They're fighting for the break from getting independence and stuff, but they also, even in the Caribbean, they're also seeing all this other stuff going on.
It now you said sometimes this is a touchy subject, and this
It is a touchy
is touchy
subject, but
subject.
I think us as researchers and listeners, we also want to understand and learn, because we just don't know.
Well,
You,
yeah,
you know,
and we can't set it down because
correct.
it's a touchy subject.
Yeah.
The reality is that Jews, I can give you a date actually under British law. Um,
Okay.
Up until 1705, there is a law that says a Jew may not own a Christian servant, and I'm putting servant in quotation marks just for
Servant.
people.
That's their word.
Right. Um, so legally, at least, there is this clause that says, well, Christians being full people get to own other people. Let's not investigate the logic of that too much. But Jews
Mhm.
can't. However, with the rise of enslavement and forced migration from West Africa, there is this idea, well, what if these slaves are pagans? Now, I will point out the idea that every single person who is kidnapped from Africa is a pagan is
Right.
nonsense. And I don't even think
Correct.
pagan is the right word to use. But to the law courts, it created some degree of distinction. And so you do begin to see white Jews exercising their rights to own other people in British North America. And I've been talking about the ways in which European Jews living in British North America are able to shed the label Jew and become white. And I think
Mhm.
this is another way that happens, which is to say, part of what defines someone as being white, it would be the ability to own someone who is not white.
And that white privilege, as we call today, comes along with that.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
And I would go ahead and call it white law because, of course, it's not.
White law.
Yeah, it's not everybody.
Yeah.
The challenge, I think, is to be perfectly honest. I think two things happened in the 20th century. This
Hmm.
is the 18th century, and I will say it is not that every single American Jew ended up being a slaveholder. It is
Correct.
true that some of the most prominent Jews in the revolution, Sheftal leaps to mind. There's a guy named Aaron
Hmm.
Lopez who
Hmm.
is heavily involved in the slave trade.
Hmm.
There are connections between Jews and slave trading. In the 20th century, two things happened. One is, as the majority of American Jews support the civil rights movement,
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
idea that a previous generation of Jews had been slaveholders and defenders of the slave system
Right.
becomes kind of anathema, and that becomes something not to be discussed, and it is sort of buried. Um,
Got it.
I think the other thing that happens is in 1991, there is a publication is made by the Nation of Islam that accuses Jews of
Hmm.
creating the slave system and operating the slave system. And this has become sort of an ongoing um, mythology and conspiracy theory. And it's a really interesting one because, again, what do David Duke also cites this study. So again, what do Nation
Right.
of Islam and David Duke
I
agree
know
on?
exactly which one you're
Yeah, I
talking
know it's great. But Shelley, so that's false. But it
Yeah.
created, this is in the 1990s, this idea that, well, the first thing that Jewish historians have to do with slavery is to deny that Jews ran the whole slave system, which is true. But it also
Right.
raises the question for us 30 years later, can we be honest about the presence of Jews among the enslavers and as a part of the merchant class that brings kidnapped people from Africa to the New World, and I think we can do this.
Hmm.
I feel very fortunate because the one thing I noticed people hadn't talked as much about is sort of the human beings who then come about because of the enslaved system, which is to say
The biracial.
these biracial Jews
Hmm.
um, who have their own lives and stories. And I was fortunate to come across a work on um, there is a place in the Caribbean called Yodin Savan,
Hmm.
and Yodin Savan is a predominantly Jewish plantation system, which is and I'm trying to look this up so that I can be absolutely correct. Um,
Yes.
Yes, it is in. It's not in Suriname. I'll get back to you. Okay, I'll answer that when
Okay.
you're talking. Anyway, Yodin Savan is off the coast of South America, and there is records there of a slave named Purim, and of course Purim is the Jewish holiday that is sort of equivalent to Halloween. It's a celebration of the Book of Esther, and people are supposed to dress up, and you have parties and all of these sorts of things. And
Okay.
so the fact that and of course, naming a person after a holiday
Yeah.
has West African roots. So isn't it
Roots.
interesting that his name is Purim? But he was also known as someone who very frequently is called in front of the law, not for major rebellions, but for challenges to the system, for disrupting religious services. Um, and
Hmm.
so the question becomes, was Purim his given name at birth and he happened to be this kind of person who tested the waters? Or did he test the waters and then was he then given the name Purim because he's in a predominantly Jewish area and Purim is this festival of misrule, and we don't know, but sort of reconstructing the life of Purim is fascinating. We have a case in Savannah where two white Jewish men used a conch shell instead of a shofar. A shofar is the ram's horn,
Right.
which is blown on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur to call people to worship. These two white Jews, are blowing on a conch shell,
That's
which is interesting.
Caribbean.
It's Caribbean, and
And it's
Shelley,
African.
and it's African, and it's Caribbean,
Yeah.
and Shelley, it's not kosher. So what are they doing blowing on the conch shell? Were they somehow, again, this is all
Yeah.
theoretical. This is what I mean when I say this stuff is theoretical.
Right. Right.
Were they just were they might be dumb, they
Right.
might have been being jerks, they might have been doing some kind of ceremony that was combining Caribbean religious behaviors and practices with Jewish religious behaviors and practices, which
Hmm.
would suggest some kind of religious community, maybe formal, probably informal,
Hmm.
that was connecting the enslaved and the enslavers. It was connecting people of African Jewish descent and European religious Jewish descent. It's these kinds of stories that give us hints as to this religious life that is only created here in North America and the Caribbean. Um, and these are the stories that I think are at the moment. These are the best places for us to start doing more research.
And that's what I was getting ready to ask us about accessing records and information as researchers. And again, it could be someone that's taking clients and this.
I lost you for a second there,
So
Shelley.
why is, I can say as an African, why that history is marginalized a lot more is coming out, but then why is the Jewish part and the revolution and the blacks, the biracial? I'm not reading stories about that. There's only a few books and things, that brings that knowledge forth. And then where would we go except to the books to find more information on this?
Shelley, I'm going to need to ask you to restate the first half of the question because I lost you there for a second.
Okay, okay. And again, apologizing to the public out here. Well, one of the things is I'd like to understand why you feel that this history is marginalized. We don't know a lot about it. In pit part of this, why is that not out here? And because we've got, is it because of the African American or the African connection that now it's being marginalized? And then where do we go to find more information and to learn about this so researchers and families.
So I think the question is sort of why has it been marginalized and how do we correct that? Where do we go from here? Um, I would say this is definitely a sort of a marginalized history, but it's also I won't say it's coming out of marginalization because I'm not going to say that, but it's starting to. I feel like it's starting to be more available. Why is it marginalized? I'm only speaking from my own experience. There is a mythology in the United States, which we can call it the founding fathers mythology, which is that,
Mm-hmm.
well, America is founded by, look at the back of, I don't remember which bill, I think it's the $2 bill where they're signing the Declaration of Independence. Look at the
Mm-hmm.
Declaration of Independence. Look at those 65 dudes, they did it. They're the ones who did everything. And then you say, did any of those people except George Washington, actually go fight? And the answer is no. um, so we have this mythology that there's a certain number of dudes who sort of created the country, and that they were all, you know, they're all white, they're all
Mm-hmm.
Christians. Not only are they all Christians, they're all church-going Christians.
Christians.
And I can tell you right now, that is not the case. Um, but uh, the idea that the revolution is a diverse movement has been a difficult one to sort of mm, get folks to think about, but it's absolutely true. I was just
Mm-hmm.
talking to Brian about the fact that there are two Chinese Americans living in New York who operate a button factory. They give buttons to the Patriots. Um, there are African Americans who join the cause and fight for freedom. Not all of them, but some of them certainly do.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there are women who are doing all of the work for the army. There's also
Right.
my favorite, Mercy Otis Warren, is a woman who's one of the great theorists of the revolution. And she writes a history of the revolution. She writes these plays about what a bunch of idiots the British are. Um, but in our particular, at this particular moment, there is a real effort, and it's a longstanding effort to reduce the revolution to the story of the founding fathers. And this is I'm not the
Mm-hmm.
first person to say this, but this idea of the important thing for you to learn is the character of the founding fathers. And if you know their character, then you
Mm-hmm.
understand them. And I think that's not true, because of course, how do you win a revolution? It ain't. I mean,
Right.
I'm a big fan of good character, but it takes a lot of work. It takes diplomacy. It takes patience. It takes strategy. It takes organizing materials, and it takes labor. And thinking
Yes.
about how all of those things work together introduces us to the huge variety of people who contribute to the American Revolution, and hence, in as far as I'm concerned, are a diverse group of people that create the nation. In other words, the nation is not there's this idea that diversity or pluralism is somehow this thing that came along in 1965. And that's
Mm-hmm.
nonsense. It's been there from the very beginning. And I think the Jews are a clear case. I mean, the Jews are a case where it's very easy to see, here are white people who had legal disabilities that then don't have them after the revolution is over. So in that case, the revolution does begin expanding the freedom. So that's me sort of going off a little bit, because it's something that's really important to me. Is this idea? I will also say the idea that if we just learn their character, then we're all set, is deeply problematic. Um, Learning how to organize is not dependent on character. I want you to have good character, but there's a lot of other stuff that's worth knowing about. In terms of where do we go for more information about this? Um, like I said, in many ways, this kind of work is still, it's not in its infancy. We've had
Mm-hmm.
Aviva Ben-Ur has done good work. Laura Liebman has done some really remarkable work. Um, there are books of biography of American Black patriots that have sort of been resuscitated over the last
Mm-hmm.
few years. One thing I think, I'm no genealogist, be clear about that. Genealogy is very hard. um, but one thing that I think
It
is
is. But
it's
it's so
so
rewarding, though.
um, one of the things that I think is important to do, though, for genealogists, for historians, both amateur and professional,
Mhm.
is finding stories like the story of Purim or like the story of the Brandon
Right.
siblings, which is to say, one of my theories. Uh, Again, I've already got on one soapbox. I'll get on another one. One of my great theories of history is that people have names, and one of the best ways we teach history is to find the name of particular individuals, especially if we think they're sort of breaking the mold. They're doing unusual things we don't expect them to
Mhm.
do.
Right.
And when we do, if we can identify their names and even begin to reconstruct their lives a little bit, we really have not just a way first of all, I think it's good just because we're able to it's a little bit of a testament to people who have largely been forgotten. Um, but it's also a storytelling way of thinking about it. I
Okay.
find, again, I primarily teach the 18th and early 19th century. So I deal a lot
Mhm.
with enslaved populations. And I
Mhm.
think right now, again, my opinion only, we're doing a pretty good job of talking about the enslaved. But the problem is that when I deal with my students and with the general public, the enslaved, I don't think really captures it can become a bit of a label. Whereas when I talk about someone like Purim, or I talk about there was a enslaved man who was only known as the Runaway, who wrote a book in
Mhm.
1838 about his experiences in South Carolina, and he
Mhm.
was someone I investigated because he was owned both by a Christian and then by a Jewish
Mhm.
enslaver, and he,
Mhm.
compared and contrast. He wouldn't have used that phrase, but he talks about these things. Um, you know, being able to figure this out has been, um, it's been great, and it brings us into sort of the stories of the
Mhm.
people who actually lived. And if you that's something someone can do, you can do it on your own, you can do it as a
Sure.
professional, as an amateur, um, can really bring light to the story of the I don't want to say the legacy of slavery, but of how it worked, and how people lived under it, which again, in my opinion, allows us to really think about it in terms of people who lived under it and had full lives, you know,
Right.
instead of trying to grapple with it as a moral catastrophe. We should grapple with it as a moral catastrophe, but
Absolutely.
we also need to think about, it's not just, the issue of the story of slavery isn't just the way it makes us feel right now. That is
Correct.
part of it. But actually understanding the people who lived through it is for me, it has to the extent that I did it in this book, it was a real gift, and it helps tell the story.
And what is the name of your book again?
Name of my book is A Promised Land: Jewish
Okay.
Patriots, the American Revolution, and the Birth of Religious Freedom. And if
And
you're
and I think go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Oh, and I think what I'd like to do is ask you one more question before I get disconnected, and then challenge you to sit back with me and we record this session, with just the two of us when we know we got good connections. You're in another country,
Yeah,
and and so forth. So
I'm
the
looking at
connection.
hey, I'm looking at the here's a guy we don't expect to see. The guy who
Uh-huh.
founded the first Black Baptist church in Georgia is the same guy who founded the first Black Baptist church in Nova Scotia, and who founded the same first Black Baptist church in Sierra Leone.
Really?
Yeah, guy's name is David
See,
George.
David George.
Yeah,
You know
amazing,
I'm going to look that up.
amazing person.
All right, I'm writing that down.
Okay.
And again, what would you like to kind of sum this up? You know, and again, I want to book some time with you so we can walk back through this because there's more questions, but I think the disconnecting and me popping in and out to me is frustrating. But what would you like people to take away from what you've communicated today? You've got a book out there, you know, and so forth. And we both agree that there's so much more to this going on during the American Revolution and even coming towards the Civil War as well. The Caribbean aspects are fascinating to me. And it's like, what are they doing down there? You know, and this kind of
I'm gonna jump in and say, first of all, I'll do some self promotion because again, it's 2026. We're all self promoting, or we're supposed to be. I don't. For those of you who are interested in this kind of thing, in June of 2026, I will release a series of lectures through the teaching company called
okay.
1776 Years That Mattered, which is a
Oh.
world history of 1776. So not just there's a revolution in the United States, but there are also transformations going on in the Caribbean, in South
Mm-hmm.
America. This is around the time Hawaii becomes unified. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and there's all sorts of interesting things going on in West Africa and in Europe. It's a great series with unusual stories. And I think that the takeaway, if you want to buy a promised land, I encourage you to do that.
I did.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, it makes a great Mother's Day gift. Are we close enough? Um,
Yes.
more seriously, um, Shelley, one of the things someone told me when I was working on this and that I chose to ignore was,
Mhm.
well, Dr. Jortner, uh, there were only 3,000 Jews in the United States, so this can't be that important. And I recovered from hearing that, and one of the things I think of is actually it is small groups of people that are really important. And I don't
Mhm.
care how many of them there are, reconstructing their lives can be really important, and
Yes.
it can give us insight into much larger things. Again, there aren't, in the case of Jews, it's easy because we can see religious freedom move, we can see
Correct.
it actually increase. And
Mhm.
they're a small group of people. But any group, tiny group or small group is worth investigating. And I mean, if you're interested in a huge group of people like the New England Puritans, go
Yes.
nuts. That's great. I'm happy for you. But investigating small groups can be really helpful, especially because it lets us know about the variety of religious experience. Because otherwise, you can fall into the mistake of thinking that everybody in the past was the same, right? And in the case of the American Revolution, it's, well, everybody was probably just like the founding fathers. There was this one type of person, and that's not the case. But it can also alert us to different ways people lived and responded to crises. Um, I don't like to tell people when I'm in my classes
Mhm.
or when I'm writing that people back then did X or Y, because there's lots of different people confronting different questions and coming up with different answers, which I find to be both fascinating and incredibly comforting. Because one of the problems of 2026 is that everyone's like, well, we're so divided, and which is not great, but they make it out like this has never happened before. Whereas,
We've
fine,
been divided since dirt turned over.
I mean, I think Cain and Abel had some different
Sorry.
ideas. Um,
Right.
but
Yes.
this idea that the mythology
Yeah.
of American history
Yeah.
is there was one America and it went out and it did this. Whereas what you have in the United States is groups of people with very different views,
Right.
and there's a process. It
Right.
it takes work. So I think some people are bemoan a lost Eden, and that is
Hmm.
not true. Um, but there are also ways in which people confronted problems and found answers.
Right.
And I'm not sure that conch shell back in Savannah, I don't know, it didn't solve a problem of world historical import,
No.
but I do believe that was a religious community, and that meant something, and that's something that's worth knowing about.
And I think that's more of the discussion. And again, as a researcher myself, I'm finding connections that I didn't know I had. And I can say that probably everybody I know doing this type of research is also coming across, oh,
The best part of historical research is when you're like, wait, what? That's amazing, and that makes it all worth it.
All right, I believe she is joining us. I have a question, but let's finish with Shelley's.
yeah,
Hi,
this is
welcome back,
not, it's
Shelley.
not going to let me finish. So I'm ready. Ask your question, Brian, and we're closing out, and we're going to set another time where Dr. Joyner and I can have a good discussion without the disruptions. But please ask your question. And again, if I don't make it back in, just
Nope,
go ahead and close it out.
Thanks, Shelley.
conversation. It was a very seamless conversation. So actually, Adam, your comment about the Lost Eden narrative kind of sparked a couple of questions. I think it's kind of a good time to have the conversation. So I'm coming at this kind of in the history of the world and one country colonizing other countries. There's never been a history of wealthy people actually building or doing anything. That's, and when it comes to this country, that was the whole reason for slavery. I know there's the narrative that Africans were dumb, backward, stupid. People refused to acknowledge that there were thriving kingdoms, for the time period, technologically advanced civilizations. But with Jamestown, I keep telling people 1607, that was England's third rodeo. The other
Yeah,
two versions of Jamestown had already failed. This one was literally hanging on by its little cat nails,
yeah.
literally hanging on. They were dying out. So bringing those Angolans who arrived in 1619, they're the ones who actually saved the colony and allowed it to prosper. But I'm going to
Absolutely.
cycle back to the Lost Eden thing. Never in the entire history of this country has this been a majority white country. People tend to forget. We don't even know how many Native Americans there were to the west of the Mississippi in that really early colonial period. We just concentrate on the tribes that were being genocided and just kind of driven out of their territories to the east of the Mississippi. Where is this kind of concept that America was always was a white man's country, that it was a majority white country? Where does that come from?
There's a short answer, Brian, which is I don't know for certain. I'm going to be clear about that. I don't know for certain, but um, part of the issue is that the history of the United States was primarily, and much of world history is written as political history. And this is a reason, it's not the reason, which is to say, you write a history of the Puritans came. Just why do we start say the Puritans are the founders of the nation? Well, it is because they bring British government. And we sort of see the growth. We see this. Okay, the story of America starts when British government is transplanted to Plymouth, and then bada bing, bada boom, you know, and then ice cream is invented, and we have McDonald's, and everything is great. There's a direct line there. That's one reason why it is. The other reason has to do with, I mean, some of it has to do with the sources that historians use to write their history, and what historians used for a very, very long time was government records. And I was privileged to write a book a long time ago called The Gods of Prophetstown, which was about um, the U.S. national and territorial encounters with the Shawnee Nation in the early 1800s. And of course, not all, but most U.S. government interactions with these nations are very brief, and they are not focused on trying to reach mutual understanding. They are focused upon achieving particular objectives, often the acquisition of land. So that leaves historians then, in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, they're creating histories that are the story of the government. And that, for example, therefore, the Indians are the enemies. African Americans do not enter the story. They are there, they are the enslaved, and they are not citizens, and therefore they barely appear in a lot of these histories until the Civil War, and then rapidly forgotten about again until it's 1956, and with all Rosa, the mythology that Rosa Parks is the first Black woman ever to become tired on a Montgomery bus. That's part of the issue, is that these sources tended to privilege the idea that the story of the government, and then that ends up, because particularly white men, have been the most enfranchised, it becomes a story of them. I think the other this is also, and this I'm not doing a great job answering this question. Those viewpoints are then crystallized in the history books, particularly the history books that were written in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, which is to say the books that boomers and Gen Xers probably read in high school. And we
Can
get
I
this
just
idea. Yeah, sorry.
jump in for a hot minute? Because that's a really important timeline. Those books are being written while Pop Pop, well, Dad or Pop Pop, depending on what generation you fall, who fought in the Civil War, who may or may not have been enslavers, but you know what I mean? They were still, the last of them were still alive and kicking and still telling their stories and still regurgitating the whole racial kind of propaganda. So I'm sure that that kind of influenced the writing of those books.
It more than influenced the writing of those books.
Yes.
And it's not just, well, Grandpa doesn't want me to tell that story. There are the Daughters of the Confederacy in the American South, would write, this book is unfair. A book that sort of said the cause of the Civil War was disagreements over enslavement and whether it should be legal, and indeed whether it should be extended. They would say this is unfair. They would stamp the textbooks unfair to the South.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, these books are. This isn't just something that happens. You're right. It is created. So we have that narrative, and it makes for a very clear story, right? The story of the United States is the story of its government. And I know this sounds, the book, James Lowen's book, Lies My Teacher Told Me,
Yeah.
very clear about this. He says, actually, it sounds like I'm being liberal, but I'm actually being quite conservative, because this idea that it's the government doing everything is hogwash. The other thing is that because there's a tendency as well to use history to teach ethics and morals, which is okay, but the ethics tend to be our country's great, and to be used to teach things like geography. And I love geography, and I think geography is great. But when you are talking about the 13 colonies and you're memorizing what's the capital of all the first 13 colonies, which I've done, which my children did, it avoids being able to talk about things like the Lakota Confederacy, which also
Mhm.
formed in 1776 in and around the Black Hills and occupies this huge stretch from essentially from the Missouri River all the way to what is today Montana. And this is one of the craziest things about American history that I never ever understood. so-called Western expansion, the creation of new states in the U.S. The U.S. expands roughly to the Mississippi River, and then it jumps to the West Coast. And why does it do that? I'll tell you why it does it. The Lakota Confederacy, because the United States government does not want to mess with those guys. They are too powerful. They are too strong. And that's part of the reason why Wyoming, Montana, the Dakotas are some of the last states to come into the American Union. It's why Saskatchewan and Alberta are some of the last states to come into the Canadian Confederation, because of the power of this Native American empire. But that's not the story that got told in the 40s and in the 50s. And sometimes when this is presented to people, they say, I've never heard of that, which is very tricky, because I've never heard of that is a way to disrupt erroneous conspiracy theories. But also sometimes there's real information out there that's extremely well vetted, and it's true, and explains things like, why is Oregon a state, before Wyoming is a state? It's further west. And those need to be considered. Brian, I don't know if this answered your question. But I think we have a very simple way of saying it is, some of it, there's straight up, regular old nationalism that I think virtually every country has, which is to say we're great and our history should make us feel great, and that's part of it. And there's some of it that should also be aware of, which is to say, well, we're going to tell the story of the United States, and that is a story that has to begin on the East Coast and it has to move west, rather than tell the story where there are lots of different groups coming in and contributing and changing, and not just changing things culturally, but changing things geopolitically. That would make, and I think that makes for, a way more interesting story. There is sorry.
You just beat me to it.
Oh, sorry.
You just beat me. That was a point that I was leading up to. The country actually has an amazing, painful, bloody, some of it obscene, but we have an amazing history that, if we could ever sort ourselves out so that out of many, one could actually be the thing, we would be the country that leads the world on that. We really, really would. And I guess that's been my eternal frustration being an American, is not even attempting, not even making a really serious attempt to live up to that.
If I can add, I want to add something to that, which is, in my years of teaching, I've had similar frustrations. For anyone who's an educator out there, I think one of the ways to address this is to work with smaller stories. Sylvian Diouf has a great book from about 10 years ago called Slavery's Exiles, which is a book about maroon communities in the United States. That is to say, groups of escaped people who had escaped from slavery and formed functional communities in out-of-the-way places, particularly in southern swamps. And this is an amazing history. I mean, of course, it is tragic and it is heartbreaking. But telling the story of how these people built a community and then managed to hide it is an amazing story of human achievement. And if we told more of those stories, it's a story that can get missed. If you have to cover, with all due respect to the capital, whatever the capital of Connecticut is, I think it's Hartford. If we can skip some of that and do a little more of like, here's this really interesting story that is a story of America and of Americans, but isn't the story of, and here's how the government kept doing things, we actually get into some of those things that we want to do, like capture people's interest and teach ethics and morals. So I mean, I'm obviously, Brian, I'm in complete agreement with you. what can someone do of it as just as one person is, to adopt one of these stories or one of these areas of study and really sort of flesh it out and be like, this is a real thing. Part of my job as a historian is just like, this is a real thing that really happened. And I'm smiling because I love getting to tell people these things. It's fun. And I know that there's a lot about history that is really tragic and really upsetting. But the idea that we can only have fun when we are talking about, the founding fathers or, other white guys is not true. There's a lot of actually fun stories out there, and it's a question of being able to try to get them in front of people's eyeballs.
And I guess my final point would be that something just to respond to something that you said about the introduction of British governance. May have done that, but the introduction of British governance didn't put turkey, corn, potatoes, or any of that stuff on the table.
No, it didn't.
No, they didn't.
And I don't know if you all, maybe you know this, but at the actual first Thanksgiving, Native Americans outnumber white people 7-1.
Yes.
Which means that what we have is not really a story of, again, the mythology is the Europeans come over, their system is so awesome that everybody's just in awe of it. What you actually have is you have Europeans coming over and being adopted into a treaty system by an existing series. And that is something that is well worth sort of knowing and thinking about. And that's the history of New England from 1620 for the next 150 years.
Mm-hmm.
Hard to understand if you're looking at it from a colonial perspective. If you look at it from a perspective of Native American geopolitics and treaty arrangements, it makes total sense.
So my final parting comment before I hand this back to Shelley is, this is why I left. This is one of the reasons why I have not one, but two American history and specifically Black American history focused podcasts. Because the history is, despite all, a lot of the negative things, I find it fascinating. And I think the sterilization of our history has made it less appealing, specifically to younger generations. I was bored senseless. I'm like, okay, so, by the time that you get through to the third grade, you realize we're just going to talk about old dead white guys. We're not even going to be honest about who they, and I say that just as a descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry's. I can still say that. I know that the history of this country is just far richer than has actually ever been covered.
Yeah, and we need more of that. Because in women, I think history, we're supposed to find heroes and examples to follow and not to follow, and I love being able to. I love it when I find somebody, and in order to do that, you can't. We've looked at Mr. Henry and Mr. Jefferson pretty theroughly. There's a lot of other folks out there who could use the press, and they're waiting to be discovered. There's so much that we think we know everything about the past. There's so much we don't know, and sometimes I feel like it's like I've discovered a new country nobody's ever heard of. Not, and I don't mean, oh, this is a new America. I mean, like, it's like, whoa, did you guys know that Vermont tried to be its own country?
It was its own country.
It was its own country. That sort of thing,
Yeah.
Or that colonies and state, the British American colonies and some states they had coups. They did coups on other colonies and states. This show we call the United States of America, it's been a wild.
It was wild. It was wild. Again, Yeah, Maryland is founded as the Catholic country. Protestants seize control. You know, I don't know.
But it makes rich records if people will tap into it. That's where the stories get told. Ryan, I'm going to let you close it out before I get kicked off again. And I'm just telling everybody, thank you, Dr. Jortner. I will get up with you and we will have another discussion with good internet service on my end. But Brian, I'm going to bow out and let you close it out here. And if there's any questions, folks, just email us and we'll make sure that gets into the discussion that I'll have with Dr. Joyner before, because I'm sure it's going to cut off if I do my regular closing. And so I'd
Right,
rather go
Doctor.
with this stable. So thank you all.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you for being a sport and just you kept
I
coming
try.
back. I got to give you your flowers for that. You kept coming back.
It's so
So right.
frustrating. Yes.
Thank you all for joining us today for this podcast of the International African American Museum Center for Family History's podcast, and a heartfelt thank to you, our guest, Dr. Jointner, for sharing your invaluable knowledge, perspective, and dedication of preserving the history that we've been talking about. I love the fact that we were able to actually do an episode specifically, even though we kind of went off topic a little bit,
Yeah.
Jewish history within this country. Your work is not only inspiring, but also crucial in ensuring that these stories are remembered and celebrated. To all our viewers and listeners, whether you joined us on right, YouTube, Facebook, or LinkedIn, we're here in person at the museum in Charleston. We appreciate your time and your engagement. Your participation is what makes this podcast such a wonderful and meaningful experience. As we wrap up, just a quick reminder, our next podcast will air live on Saturday, the April 18th with Angela Walton Raji and Terry Ligon. And we're going to be talking about the Trail of Tears, so please mark your calendars and join us for another enriching conversation. Stay tuned to our social media channels and websites for updates on the topics and guest lineup. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those questions, and keep connecting with your family history. From all of us at the IM Center for Family History, take care and have a wonderful day. Goodbye, everyone. And closing us out.